What's up guys, it's Rowan here from Smart TV. HSC Modern History. In all of the exams you've got to do source analysis. And to be honest, source analysis is one of those things that often doesn't get explicitly taught in schools, but it's also giveaway marks in your HSC Modern History exam. It's the simplest part of the paper, and therefore it's the part where you want to get 100% and maximize your marks in this area. So what I'm going to be sharing in this video is a formula, a proven formula on MacPro, I'll explain that in a moment, that will help you get full marks in the source analysis component of your Modern History HSC exams. So on MacPro is the acronym or the formula that we're going to use, and the O stands for origin. So the first thing you need to do when you look at a source is you need to look at the origin of the source. So, is it primary or a secondary source, for example? Right? And this matters because if you think about it, a primary source has been written at the time, where a secondary source could have been written 5 years, 10 years, 100 years later even. So what's really critical is you want to look at the origin and think about primary, secondary, and the timing of when the source was actually constructed. That's going to be useful when we start thinking about reliability and we start thinking about usefulness. Now, additionally, one of the things you want to think about with the origin of the source as well is, where does it come from? Which perspective does it relate to? And we're going to look at perspective in a little bit more depth, but for example, is the origin, Greek? Is it English? Is it, German? Is it Chinese? And how might that influence some things as well? And again, we're going to look at what it influences, but that's the first step. That's O, origin. So the M in on MacPro is motive, right? And so what we're trying to find here is why was this source published? So if it was a textbook, maybe it's been published to, consolidate the knowledge on a particular topic, to educate people, right? If it was a poem, maybe it was to entertain, maybe it was a process of dealing with an emotional experience. If it was a letter, maybe the purpose was to communicate some key information to a loved one, a family member. Of course, if it's a newspaper, it might have a propaganda element. So you need to think about the motive, and of course that's going to influence and change by the nature of the source, right? So the origin is going to have an influence here, and the point of this is it's going to then influence for you in how you think about usefulness and reliability. If there's a really strong motive to persuade someone of something, if it's propaganda, for example, it might not be as reliable in sharing, the truth about how things were at the time. But on the flip side, it might be really reliable in a showcase of evidence of the types of propaganda that existed. So once again, just because a motive, there might be a bias or an ulterior motive, it doesn't necessarily render something not useful or reliable. It's just going to change how that might be the case. So that's motive, and that's M in the formula. So the A in on MacPro is audience. Okay, and that's all about, who is this source's intended audience? Was it a private audience? So, if it was a letter, it'd be written to an individual. Was it a mass audience? If it was a newspaper, it might be going out to the mass public. Is it an audience of academics if it was a textbook? Now again, this is important and it matters because the audience is going to influence, for example, reliability and usefulness. A letter is going to say different things. It's for a personal audience. It might reveal greater truths. It might be more candid. While, a newspaper article written for the mass public might actually simplify things. It might have a propaganda message in there. It might be designed to, actually make a public audience, a mass audience, feel more confident. So the audience can actually have a huge impact, and you've got to identify this, and you've got to be able to analyze and say, as I have, well, look, here's some of the consequences of the source having this particular audience. So the C in on MacPro is content. And so what you've got to look at is you've got to go into the source itself and actually analyze what is it actually saying? What is it telling you? What's the information within it, and is it corroborated perhaps by any other source? Does it add to it, or is it something that's entirely new? Now, part of this and part of what you're wanting to do is, you're wanting to analyze it, particularly if it's an image. And so this is going to feel really Englishy, but if it's an image, for example, it's a poster, it's a picture, a photograph that's been taken at a certain time period. You need to be able to look into the photo and identify what's in the foreground, what's in the background, what's the salient feature here. Is there any symbolism going on? So you've got to be able to actually analyze the content itself to try to draw as much meaning as you can from it, so that you can then comment upon, particularly when you're doing an analysis on usefulness of the source in terms of saying something that's going to be useful for a historian studying whatever the topic is. So there you have it. That's the C, the content, in ON-MAC-PRU formula. So the P in ON-MAC-PRU stands for perspective. And so what we're trying to identify here is, what point of view the source actually represents. So, what are the beliefs and opinions that the source represents? Now, this stands a little different for origin. Remember, we looked at origin and we said, well, look, where's the origin? Is it English? Is it an English source? Is it a German? Is it a Greek? Is it a Russian? Is it a Chinese? That's about origin. But note, the perspective could be different. While the source's origin could be from one place, the perspective could actually be different. It could represent, a different opinion or a different sort of point of view. So, this is important because often there can be biases inherent in sources, and the perspective therefore can influence reliability. But it can also be very, very powerful for usefulness, right? Because certain perspectives can shed a light on, how people were feeling in a certain place at a certain time. And so perspective can be really, really powerful for usefulness, but it can also influence reliability, particularly if bias is evident in the source. So that is perspective. So the R in ON-MAC-PRU stands for reliability. And so, really the point of many of the questions you're going to get is ultimately about evaluating reliability of the source. And so what we're trying to understand here is, well, really, how true is it? Are there any factors here that might undermine our ability to say, yes, what's represented here is actually something that we can use because it is reliable or not? Now, things are going to influence this, and we've looked at some of them, but for example, audience can influence reliability, because the audience combined with motive could suggest that, perhaps this is a propaganda piece, and so it's not that reliable in perhaps truly reflecting the perspectives at the time. Maybe it's a secondary source that's been written many, many years later, piecing together fragments of what was available at the time. And so as a result, it's really not that reliable because, perhaps its access to primary sources is poor. Or maybe it's a historical source, it's a secondary source that's been written, but it's more in a narrative form for a mass market public audience to popularize something. And so as a result, once again, maybe this is going to reduce the reliability in being actually something that we can say, yes, is truthfully representing what happened, an event, a person at the time. So we need to look at all of the prior, right? Origin, motive, audience, content, perspective. We need to look at all of those and how that might influence usefulness. So the U in ON-MAC-PRU stands for usefulness, and this is really, really critical. Ultimately, the questions that you're asked are all about reliability and usefulness, analyzing the source. So going through all the other steps, the origin, the motive, the audience, and so forth, is all about trying to say something about how useful is this source. And the way we want to think about usefulness is the 3 R's. The first thing we want to think about is, okay, great, is this source actually relevant? It could be a brilliant source, but not actually for the question that you've been provided with. So you've got to look at relevancy. Is there relevancy here? And then that's going to make it useful. Secondly, you want to look at if it's revealed an insight. So that's the second R. So it's got to say something actually that's interesting and that's insightful about the topic that you've been asked about. So again, it could have lots of wonderful information, but they could be revealing insights that are not relevant, or it might not actually be revealing anything particularly insightful, and there may be better sources available. And then the final thing here is reliable. For a source to be useful, it needs to be reliable. Or does it? And this, I think, is important to note. Reliability will influence usefulness. If a source is entirely non-reliable, it's like, honestly, how useful can it be? You can't trust it. But at the same time, don't write off a source just because on the face of it, it might not seem to be as reliable. It can still be useful. A source that's unreliable can still be useful in highlighting perspectives. It can be highlighting how people feel. It could be highlighting the complexity in actually identifying the true narrative, if there is such thing, in the particular event or topic you're looking at. So reliability does influence usefulness, but don't necessarily write off a source if you've got questions about reliability. Still, for this question in your HSC Modern History exam, you want to look, you want to find, you want to dig for where it still can be useful. Your ability to show usefulness is going to really make your response stand out. Yes, you want to look at the limitations, that's really, really key, but never write a source off entirely. They've given it to you for a reason. You know, the markers and the Board of Studies and NESA, they believe that the source does say something that could be useful for the topic. So you've got to make sure that you can find it and highlight it in your response while also showcasing some of the limitations relating to reliability and usefulness. So there you have it. That's the formula for how to write a 10 out of 10 full mark modern history source analysis response. Now, knowing the formula is only half the journey. You've actually got to apply it. And so if you need help in applying this formula and really mastering the skill and developing those nuances of analysis, particularly relating to reliability and usefulness, get in touch with us. We have an incredible team of teachers, tutors, and mentors that can support you for modern history, right? Either one-on-one in your home, across Sydney, or at our campus in Hornsby. So get in touch, visit our website, artsmart.com.au, and we can help you and support you develop this skill. Now, additionally, we do videos like this every single week. So if you haven't already, just simply hit the subscribe button above, so that way you can hear from us next week.